Good evening and welcome to the 19th edition of the Political Mike podcast. Uh, Folks, we are here. Uh, Election day is in less than 24, well, officially less than 24 hours. This is being described by many pundits and by many political leaders and figures as the most important election of our lifetime. And it goes without saying that the stakes couldn't be higher. We are seeing two drastically different candidates running to be the president of the United States for the next 4 years. So much to talk about. Tensions are running high. I'm not going to give introductions tonight. Instead, we're just going to dive right in to the topics of discussion. And, there's news breaking even within the past few hours. But I want to start off by talking about the tightening polls. The polls, according to Quinnipiac poll that came out today, show that in Florida, a swing state that will determine so much in terms of the outcome of this election, 47% of likely voters support Biden, while 42% support President Trump. And this is a very important state. For one, you got a large Latino population in that state, and the narrative so far has been that Biden is not doing as well as he should among Latino voters. But you also have, a lot of Haitian Americans in the state. You have a lot of Caribbean Americans in the state. And so this state is so diverse, and there's so much to unpack with just looking at the underlying factors that come into play with these polls. Ohio, a huge state that Republicans seem to have secure, but now Bloomberg has invested his money and allocated some of his resources to campaign ads in that state. The state of Texas is now up in the air now, it seems, as a state that potentially Democrats can flip, looking at Harris County, Culberson County, states that Beto O'Rourke was able to flip against Ted Cruz. And of course, Congressman O'Rourke has been on the ground, been very active in terms of trying to ensure that Texas could be in the Democratic column, which hasn't been the case since 1976 when Jimmy Carter was running. So we're in uncharted territory already. But I want to open up the floor about what these polls could potentially mean and what should we be looking for tomorrow. There's a lot of hype going on right now on the internet and on cable news networks about what to anticipate for tomorrow evening. But I want to start off by, a realistic standpoint of what we could expect to see this time tomorrow evening. Professor Foster?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things to look at is what will happen in North Carolina, as well as Florida. Texas, I want to believe, is competitive. If Texas is competitive, then that will change the landscape of politics for the next generation. I think by rights, demographically, it should be competitive. But Barack Obama carried North Carolina in 2008. So it is flippable. And given the voter suppression that happened 2 years ago in Georgia, Georgia should also be competitive. So I'm interested more to see what's going to happen in the Southeast than anywhere else in the country. I say that because Pennsylvania and the Midwest is always where you look, but I think the change will come in the South and the Southeast.
And it's interesting you say that because Georgia is also a state that has been heavily invested in by both sides now. Georgia, which has not gone Democratic since 1992 when Bill Clinton was challenging George H.W. Bush. And so Democrats see that, Trump's polling numbers remind them of the days of George H.W. Bush, and that provides them some kind of motivation to go after the state of Georgia. Christian, do you think that this is the Democrats getting ahead of themselves? Because I remember in 2016, there was a narrative that potentially Hillary Clinton could even win Texas over. Are we going to see a similar situation play out based on your perspective?
My perspective is wait and see. It certainly seems like trust has been lost in polling. I was actually a major of political science and had confidence in polling. So we'll see. Yeah. Just what do you think, Mike?
Well, I think for one, um, I think no matter the outcome, I think we're going to see some surprises. Um, I think that you know Democrats would outperform their Republican counterparts in the state of Georgia, and I think it's going to be reflective also in the Senate races. I think that you know there was something going for Trump when he promised to drain the swamp, but I think there was a lot of folks who said they were tired of um, you know, these figures in Washington, D.C. who seem to be part of the furniture, so much so that they seem to forget about issues that pertain to them locally. And I think Jamie Harrison has capitalized on that. I think it was evident in the debate when Lindsey Graham constantly tried to portray him as a national liberal, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders. And Jamie Harrison kept trying to say, hey, let's bring it back home to South Carolina. I think that's indicative of what's going around the country. Arizona is also a case in point where you have the senator there, the sitting Republican senator, not willing to say on a debate stage that she supports enthusiastically Donald Trump. But Chris, I'm interested in getting your take. You're in Pennsylvania. You're on the ground. Pennsylvania is a huge state in this election. I think besides Florida, that state really determines the different avenues that Biden has towards the presidency. What are you seeing on the ground, and what are your thoughts as to how things will play out in the battleground state of Pennsylvania?
Well, I'm proud to say that all eyes will be on Pennsylvania starting tomorrow morning. And as you know, both campaigns have really put laser focus on the Commonwealth, including other states that are part of the Midwestern belt, including Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But I really do believe that Pennsylvania may be the Florida of this election, where whether it's on election night or days after the election, all of America will be looking to see what the final vote count will be. And part of that is because Joe Biden has had really strong roots here in Pennsylvania. He's a child of Scranton, and he was a senator in our neighboring state of Delaware, and so we are very familiar with him. However, much like a lot of parts of Pennsylvania, a lot of people really did support Donald Trump, and they went for him surprisingly in 2016, where he was able to claim 20 electoral college votes. And so since 2016, the Democratic Party has really been laser focused on winning back those blue wall states that surprised us all 4 years ago. Like, I did not think that Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan were going to be claimed by Trump. Those were the states that we just knew, if we didn't win Florida, if we didn't win North Carolina, we had these three states, kind of in our bag, and they were ripped away from us. And so one of the good things about Pennsylvania is Supreme Court allowed for mail-in ballots to arrive up to 3 days after Election Day, and they will be counted. And so what we're trying to do right now on the ground is just try to allow for voters to understand that patience is truly going to be the biggest virtue on Election Day. Do not expect an outcome or a declaration unless the lead is really far and really high, which is unlikely here. Unless the lead is really high, we should not expect a result until later in this week or beyond. So just trying to keep people patient, do what they can to get out the vote, and let the powers be going forward.
Yeah, it's a good thing that you brought that out because, North Carolina, the law is that 9 days after the 3rd, which is tomorrow, votes can be accepted by the Board of Elections. So every state, we're seeing that every state is taking a different approach to how they're going to count their ballots. But what's interesting is that this year seems to have smashing records of voter turnout already. 72% of the 2016 total vote has already been in. When you're looking at mail-in ballots cast, you have 63,471,568 votes. In-person votes, 35,167,850 votes. The total amount, 98,639,418 votes in total. And I think a lot of Democrats are feeling enthusiasm comparable to levels of 2008. But of course, there's a lot of fear behind getting ahead of ourselves because there could be a secret Trump vote out there. Garrison, what are your thoughts? Do you think that there are a group of individuals who are not making their opinions known to pollsters, but on election day they're going to come out in droves and numbers that surprise political experts again?
Sorry I'm late, first off. But yeah, I think already with the unaffiliated votes that we've already seen in North Carolina, a ton of those voters have already somewhat cast their ballots. I think traditionally we know that Republicans and conservatives typically go out on election day to actually cast their ballot. So people that are sitting on the fence, I feel at this point they've made up their mind. I think they're gonna go, if they haven't already, on November 3rd. And as to like what party they're gonna go for, unaffiliated, I feel like probably the ones that haven't voted, I think a majority of them would go Democrat. The ones that there's a minority, I think, of unaffiliated voters that will vote Republican this year.
That's really interesting. And you know, and I know you're coming from the state of North Carolina, which is also now a battleground state. When you have a really competitive Senate race between, you have Tom Tillis running against, I'm sorry, his name escaped me,
Kyle Cunningham.
Cal Cunningham. You know, very interesting race, because what you have with Cal Cunningham is a situation where he seemed to have been getting away with a sizable lead for a traditionally Republican state. But then all of a sudden a texting scandal happens. And the idea was that this was going to be the thing that tanks him. But surprisingly, he's still been able to manage a lead. It wasn't as big as it was before, but he's been able to maintain a lead above Tillis. And I'm wondering if this is indicative of a momentum across the country when you're looking at states in South Carolina, when you're looking at Colorado, Arizona, Montana, with Steve Bullock running against Daines. You have, you know, Democrats looking at each state, and I you know, have to take a step back and say, you know, each of these candidates seem to be specifically perfectly tailored for their state. I think this race actually has a lot of good candidates running, and it's very competitive. But Nate, what are your thoughts on that? What kind of Senate races are you looking at? And do you think that only the presidential election will not be called, or do you think we can call some Senate races by tomorrow evening?
Hopefully we will be able to call some Senate races. Personally, the races I'm looking at include the ones out west, like Montana and Colorado, as well as the South Carolina race. I know Harrison is technically a long shot, but I would not be surprised at all to see him win there. I'm also paying attention to the Georgia elections. We've got where two elections this year. One is John Ossoff for a 6-year term. The other is fronted. The Democratic contender on that side is Raphael Warnock, the senior pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, facing off against Kelly Loeffler and Doug Collins to see who wins there. And it's actually not really out of the question for Democrats to win both there, even if it doesn't happen tomorrow night. As you all know, in Georgia, you need 50% in order to claim full victory. Otherwise, you go to a runoff. But the Montana race interests me for a pretty big reason. Governor Bullock is one of the few people with a D next to the name on the ballot that can win a statewide race there. And although he has been down in the polls, pretty much every poll has had him within the margin of error. Also, this is a state that 4 years ago Trump carried by around 20 points. Bullock was reelected by a very thin margin, but this time around, Trump is only leading by about 7. So it's not really a good sign for the incumbent, especially when Bullock has been praised by Montanans across the aisle for his response to the coronavirus pandemic. So same with Colorado, where that race looked originally to be kind of a toss-up until John Hickenlooper left the presidential race and decided he was going to focus his attention on the Senate. And what that looks like, if the Democrats are able to take back the Senate, it looks like there's a new balance of power that shifts westward, because then you've got a Democrat in Montana, a Democrat in Colorado that helped you kind of take back the balance of power. So it's very interesting to see committee assignments and things of that nature.
Yeah, I'm glad that you took that national approach as to, you know, state by state. when it comes down to certain races, there's certain races like the one in Alabama that you just have a gut feeling, and based on looking at polling and everything, that's just indicating to go towards the Republican side. When you've got Doug Jones going as Tommy Tuberville, and it was such an anomaly to have Doug Jones. I remember the surprise that took place in December of 2017, but at the same time, he was running against a candidate where it wasn't just one person coming out with allegations, but it was one after the other, and it got to a point where you couldn't just look past it. That seemed to define Roy Moore's candidacy. But when you also look at Alaska, you kind of know, okay, the Republicans are going to win that, but it seems like the amount of states that are up in the air have increased this year. Usually there's about 2 or 3 states that people can't really call early on, but this time you're looking at Arizona. Mark Kelly, who's an astronaut, famous astronaut, who his wife was a victim of gun violence, Gabby Giffords. She's rose into national prominence since then. You're looking at, like you had mentioned, John Hickenlooper, former Colorado governor, very popular governor. He was running for president. He didn't seem like he had a legitimate shot in the presidential run, but I think that race actually helped raise his national profile. Bullock running against Daines. I've seen a lot of YouTube ads over the course of this whole election cycle with Trump Jr., Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio asking for donations for their friend Daines. But I'm wondering because there's always that narrative that when you nationalize the race, that helps Republicans. But if you make things local, if you kind of spend less time trying to fly in celebrities and fly in guest speakers and national figures, that actually works in the Democrats' favor. Cassandra, your thoughts?
On flying in celebrities or like having some kind of like national versus local, like boring government.
Yeah, like when races become nationalized, do you believe that certain races in this election have become nationalized? And if they have, do you think that will work in one party's favor above the other?
Well, certain elections, I think this cycle have gotten a lot more focus, I think, nationally, purely because of the ripple effect they're going to have. The one that comes up in my mind specifically is McConnell. I feel like more and more people of like every day don't really know much about politics are becoming more and more aware of specific politicians that have a lot of pull in the national sphere, and McConnell being the majority head in the Senate. It's funny, like this is the first time around that I've had discussions with people, and they get upset about Congress as like a uniform body, but they're starting to become a more engaged conversation where people are like, wait, what's the difference between the Senate and the House? And then you have to be like, okay, well, we did cover this in 9th grade, but here we go. And then they're like, oh, okay, so that means that this person is responsible for this thing. And it's interesting because these are things that really we should all know and be engaged in and have that. But I think it's been a bit of a disservice to the country as a whole to focus a little too much on locality versus national, or only on your own locality versus like the impacts of somewhere else, because it's very easy to say, okay, I'm from Kansas, so really only important people to vote for the senators from Kansas and some of the Congress people. But I'm seeing now, especially after 2016, really, but even before that, when people were pushing for Hillary, there's been a much larger engagement with younger people, and I think that that has benefited the Democratic Party more than anyone else. That said, we've been seeing so many more voter suppression efforts this time around that are very bald-faced. They're not even trying to hide behind technical legality or anything, really. It seems just almost desperate. You can read that either as desperation, which means that the Democrats have a very strong, possibility, or you can read that as they might win through potentially morally ambiguous or morally bankrupt means. So I'm anxious. I want to have hope that this is something that will shake people into realizing that the Republican Party as it stands is kind of just holding us hostage. rather than genuinely representing some kind of values. If they did, I think that there could be a real genuine discussion back and forth. But with the context of what you said, national versus localized, people paying attention to the national is going to benefit, at least in public opinion, the Democratic Party more. That's my read on it, at least.
No, that's good. And I'm glad that you brought out voter suppression, because that's a factor that has been, this is the second election without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Since 2013 with Shelby versus Holder, which removed Section 5, removed Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, you have a situation now where all of these states don't have to check in with the Attorney General's office. They can enact these laws, these barriers, these hoops that folks have to jump through. They can eliminate same-day registration. They can enforce that you have a photo with you. All of these different tactics that historically statistics show, nonpartisan statistics, have an effect on minority voting turnout. So I'm wondering if certain states like Texas, which Beto O'Rourke has, he's been on the program and he told me backstage, he said, look, I'm asking Joe Biden, I'm asking Kamala Harris to come and invest time in the state of Texas, because this could actually be something that they regret if they don't do this. Georgia, President Obama's on the stump. States that they historically are not winning, but they're playing offense now. I'm wondering if the voter suppression tactics do play a factor in how well they actually perform in states that are southern states that historically have records of voter discrimination. Professor Foster, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Before I answer your question directly, I just want to say this about voter suppression and the Voting Rights Act. Really, is that the biggest change from the gutting of the Voting Rights Act is the shifting of the burden of proof from those who have been discriminated against from those who were discriminating to those who have been discriminated against. And that is, now you must not only prove that you've been discriminated against, but the intent of the change was discriminatory. That emboldens, because if you look at just what happened in 2014, the year after the Voting Rights Act was gutted, you see explicit voter suppression from the very same states that preclearance applied to. So it's not a myth. And I think I take Justice Roberts at his word that he thought that things had changed. But it's not a myth that these bad actors were under preclearance. It was for a reason. But I also think that that reason is the reason that perhaps the electoral map may change for a generation, because in Georgia, in North Carolina, even in Alabama, 2 years ago, we elected Doug Jones by a margin of 30,000 votes. But to have a democratically elected senator in Alabama is notable. States like Florida are kind of in flux because you have the dynamic of Cuban Latinos who are historically Republican, but you also have an influx of other Latinos and others who have migrated from the North who are tending to trend Democratic. I think the biggest change in Florida is actually the seniors who are now coming back to the Democratic Party, who voted for Trump maybe for their tax cuts, but they see that COVID and other things are literal threats to their lives. So, and then the other thing, other hopeful sign for those of us from the liberal side of the aisle is that young voters are voting in record numbers in key states like Florida. And that is the most hopeful sign for me. But very quickly, the thing that gives me the most pause is the purposefulness of the chaos that Donald Trump has telegraphed that he will throw into the mix starting tomorrow night. And that chaos is purposed to not only decrease people's confidence in democracy, but also to do what Putin wants done, which is for people to discount democracy, not only in the United States, but around the world. So I think tomorrow night will be a historic night, but an important night for the whole notion of democracy worldwide.
You know, and you raised an important point, Professor, because tonight, you know, news broke that the White House is erecting a non-scalable fence around the White House. You know, when have we ever had an election where the night before they've had to take such a precaution? You know, tensions are increasingly high. And I think Jay Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, said on CNN, he said, look, I've never, you know, seen an election with so much tension before. You know, tensions could not possibly be higher. And so no matter what the outcome is, you know, even if there's no official, you know, winner of the magic 270 electoral votes, I think that we're going to see more violence, no matter what. I think that we're going to see chaos. I think we're going to see riots. But I do think that's the result of what we've seen over the past 4 years. You know, this is not just falling out the sky. This is bubbled over, you know, from Charlottesville and before. And so, you know, when we're looking at these situations, we have to look at it, and I encourage folks to look at it as one long story. You know, it's so easy to pinpoint different stories here and there in isolation. But when you take the story and kind of connect it with what was going on last year, what was going on the year before, things don't seem as random as the media may portray it to be. But I want to go ahead and continue talking a little bit about Senate races, because specifically there was a race, you know, in Kentucky. Mitch McConnell, the Senate House Majority Leader, going up against a veteran, Amy McGrath. And in the debate they had recently, what came up was COVID-19 relief. And you know, he had said that the House Democrats did not take any action in terms of getting COVID-19 relief passed. McGrath responds, well, the House passed a bill. You know, the House passed the HEROES Act. And so he laughs in response. And a lot of folks have focused on that laughter as a highlight of the debate. And to me, I thought it was indicative of him being confident that he will win. Mackenzie, now that I have you, I want to get your thoughts in that race. How do you think that's going to turn out? What do you think that meant in terms of McConnell's response?
I feel like everyone is scared. I feel like people know that their time is coming to a close. Everyone knows it. Donald Trump even knows it. Those rallies that he goes and he stands and he laughs and he talks on, that is pure fear. He knows that his time is coming to a close, in my opinion. And honestly, I feel like the fear is kind of in the wrong audience. The media is trying to, you know, make this election be some type of scare tactic. You know, people are scared. You know, they're worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. Are we not going to have a president? I mean, when are we going to know who the president's going to be? You know, is this going to turn out to be a thing where Donald Trump refuses to, you know, sit down, you know, move on? What is going to happen? But honestly, I feel like it's all for nothing. By 10 o'clock tomorrow, I feel like we're going to know who won the presidency. I genuinely believe that this is going to be a race that is not going to, you know, be one that everybody is trying to make it out to be. They're scaring people. And honestly, I don't think it's a good thing at the moment, considering all that we're going through. So I feel like everybody just needs to kind of calm down, because I feel like, you know, at the end of the day, people are going to make the right choice, regardless of party. Regardless.
You know, and you actually made a prediction that was very familiar. James Carville, the former campaign manager of Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential run, had predicted repeatedly on cable news networks that it's going to be an early, decisive win in favor of Biden. Jerry, your thoughts? You've been involved with radio. You've been on the ground in Texas, especially. And I'm really curious to get your thoughts as to whether you think it's going to be as decisive or as early as Mackenzie expressed.
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty decisive. I'm looking at Arizona as being a really big state because, I think both candidates today have spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania, and that's a state that Trump has to win. But, Biden has his backup plan that, if he doesn't win Pennsylvania, he has his route through Arizona and some other states to still get him to 270. But it seemed as if Trump has really this only one route where he has to really run the table. I think when you look at, I'm down here in Texas, and I think a lot of Democrats will tell you this, and I know you talked to Beto a couple of weeks ago, but Texas has never really been a red state. What Texas Democrats says would be that Texas has been like a non-voting state. We've been a state that has been ranked maybe 49th, 48th in the country in voting. And that had a lot to do with some of the Republicans, in control of really the local elections here. But as what we have seen here, like in Harris County, we finally have a election clerk who is doing everything he can to invest in our elections and to make sure that, their elections are as convenient and as accessible as possible. And you're seeing record numbers here, in Harris County, where we have more voters and more early voters in Harris County than we had in Nevada, the entire state in Nevada, in their entire 2016 total. All right. So there's going to be a big, I think, story tomorrow night on election day because, people think, well, Hillary lost Texas by 9 points in 2016. Texas is a deep red state. Well, Beto lost maybe by like 2 points, all right, in 2018. And there has been this demographic change, and not in the way that I think a lot of people has been talking about it. When people talk about demographic change, they're thinking about like the big influx of the Latino population to Texas. The population change that I'm really seeing is really there's been 2 states that have really lost a lot of residents. I think California and Illinois, and most of those residents from California are moving to Texas. And you're kind of starting to see that in your metro areas in Houston and Dallas and Austin. That you have, really this migration of people from other states who are coming from more liberal states to Texas. So I really think that there's going to be a decisive victory tomorrow. I think the states you have to look out for is Arizona. I'm hoping for Texas, but if you have a Florida or you have just a Pennsylvania or Michigan and Wisconsin, Biden has so many different routes to win this thing. But I do think that I think people need to look at Texas a little more seriously because, as I said earlier, Texas is not a red state. We've been a non-voting state. And now we're going to see tomorrow what our state really looks like when people go out and vote.
And I'm glad you portrayed the picture because a lot of folks are confused as to what to anticipate in terms of, usually on election night, you see the states glow red or blue depending on who won the state, and you see who's the winner of the electoral votes in that state. But you portrayed that the Biden camp actually is looking at different routes around losing Florida. But if they, Florida has 29 electoral votes. If they lose Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, they've got to win the Rust Belt. But you also, portrayed what the underlying factors are in the state of Texas, because there's a lot of talk about Texas turning blue. But when you look at the demographics, that's where the conversation should be taking place. Arizona, key state. I know that this was a state that, it'll be something out of the ordinary usually for a Democrat to win that state. I think Bill Clinton won it in '96 against Bob Dole, but that was also a landslide election. But, there are different paths to victory that don't include Florida. But if those other paths of victory don't go the way the Democrats want, Florida might be the thing that really pulls everything apart. 2000, there was a saying, I think Tim Russert had said Florida, 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 because Florida in that election was a key state. But I think, Chris, you pointed out Pennsylvania is going to be that state for this year. So all eyes, I think, are on multiple states. There's not one state in this election that I think will be the key determining factor that pundits go back to in history to say this was the state that determined it. I think it's going to be multiple states. Garrison, your thoughts? Do you agree? Or
I think it's going to be a super close race. I don't think we're going to know who wins tomorrow night. I think it's going to be a month out. I think Florida is going to be the state that we're going to be looking towards. And I think I seriously doubt, unless it's a landslide, which it very well could be. But if it's not, we're going to be waiting for like a month or so. I think there's more of a chance of that happening than it actually being a landslide this year. There's too many votes that have already been cast. People know who they want to be president. And our nation is split right down the middle right now. So it could honestly go either way. And I think it's going to be drawn out.
So let's transition a little bit to the legal battle that might unfold. The U.S. District Court Judge Andrew Hannon in Texas, Harris County, Texas specifically, threw out a lawsuit today that was challenging the legality of some 127,000 votes cast at a drive-through voting site in the Houston area. Jerry, that's your territory. The judge ruled out that the plaintiffs don't have legal standing. Now, as a law student, I know that means that the plaintiff, in this case, those who are alleging that those 127,000 votes should be thrown out, they didn't suffer an injury in fact, or the injury is one that was a legally protected interest, which is A, concrete, or B, actual or imminent. Or it could be that the judge felt that the plaintiff had to have a causal connection with their harm between the injury and the conduct brought before the court, or it has to be likely rather than speculative that these 127,000 votes were illegal or should have been cast aside. Regardless of how the court came to its conclusion, it came to the conclusion that there was no standing. And I think this is going to be indicative of how we're looking at, piecemeal approaches as to different courts across the country, federal courts, on how they approach this situation. So the legal battle that we're hearing about, a lot of these, battles are going to be fought in these federal courts. Now, the thing is, President Trump has filled in, I believe, over 400 federal district court and appellate court judge positions since the Obama administration left office. Mr. Stephen Foster, if you're with me, I want to get your thoughts as to how this legal battle can play out, and also, the fact that Trump has not promised or confirmed that he would accept the election results without this battle. How do you think that's going to play out in this election? We've seen some unprecedented things these past 4 years. This election, I think we're never going to see anything like this. How do you think this is going to turn out? Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead. Okay, so if his mic is not working, Nate, if you can jump in.
Well, as far as the legal battle goes, like you said, Judge Hannon ruled that the challengers didn't have standing because Harris County has been using drive-in voting since September. So he's basically saying, why are you coming to me now with this issue? One thing that was really interesting is that he said that even if he found that they did have standing, he would not have thrown out the disputed ballots, but he would have thrown out drive-in ballots that were cast tomorrow and tried to discourage people in Houston from drive-in voting tomorrow. Now, officially, this isn't over. They might take this to the Fifth Circuit, but standing questions are usually upheld as you go up the line. So the Fifth Circuit would probably, if the Fifth Circuit took it, they'd probably uphold the ruling. But I think it's more likely that they pass. If the Fifth Circuit upholds and they go to the Supreme Court, the court knows that they cannot afford the kind of loss of credibility they suffered after Bush v. Gore. I think they would probably as well try to pass on it because by effectively determining the outcome of a presidential election in 2000, the Supreme Court lost that whatever veneer of impartiality they had. And someone like Chief Justice Roberts, who is very concerned with his legacy of trying to maintain the neutrality and objectivity that the court is supposed to be known for, I doubt he's going to want to put his finger on the scales in that way. But I do think this case is a really good sign. The judge that ruled on it is a Bush appointee who is normally known for his conservative decisions. Like he was the judge actually that set the scale for the ACA discussion that the that the Supreme Court is going to hear next week. So we are seeing good signs from the courts. This is also the same decision. He also upheld a decision that the Texas Supreme Court, which was pretty much all Republican appointees, made. So So this kind of legal battle that the Trump administration is hoping to wage might not be the best option for them.
And I'm glad you laid out the landscape as to what we're looking at specifically when it comes down to the Fifth Circuit, and what kind of appointees are in place that are going to be hearing these cases. So everyone's afraid that 2000 is going to repeat itself, because we saw that it wasn't until, I believe, the 7th of December that Al Gore conceded that race. And that month was just a month of constant tension and everything, but it wasn't anything like what we were seeing in 2020, when you have an ongoing pandemic, racial tension all throughout this year, and a lot of anxiety about the outcome of this election. And I'm wondering if any of the political pressure will have any kind of influence at all on the court's decisions or the way this legal battle plays out. Cassandra?
I think that the fact that we are even having this discussion and the current administration has handled everything so ineptly is it's very alarming to me. Because what that says to me is that, short of this pandemic, there wouldn't really be a discussion of who would have all the chips. So that scares me a little bit. I think that the fact that we have all been stuck sort of indoors since March means that people have a lot more time to, for better or for worse, spend a lot of time on the internet. And with all of that, I think people are this time around more or less more informed. And that generally means that they're angrier because they know that this was all avoidable. So I think that as we touched on earlier, the turnout for early voting has already surpassed the total voting from 2016. And I don't want to necessarily compare the two because it's apples and oranges. 2016, we had a very different global and national landscape than we do now. But even back then, I don't know if you all remember, it was still pretty fervent. People really wanted to come out and vote. Some people obviously didn't take it seriously. We had so many independent, and then some people who did write-ins for Harambe. I don't think we're going to see that as much this time around. We might see a percentage that try to vote for Kanye because I've heard members of the community talking about not being happy with either of the options, the Democratic or the Republican candidate. But I don't think that's as big of a danger as the splitting vote last time was, because now people know, you either vote for the winner or it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, that's the way that our electoral system works in the United States. So to answer your question, I think the pandemic is vastly going to affect it. I think that it's definitely the massive failure of this administration that we can all point to. They can't get around that. Even if they try to spin it one way or another and they're trying to mitigate damage that it's done to their image, there's no getting really around it.
I'm glad you brought that up. The fact that there's sometimes there's a third party contender. When I had Professor Alan Lichtman as a guest, he said, there was no serious third party contender this year. And despite folks being concerned about whether Kanye West will pull away votes because he has celebrity and whether, you want to think that the Green Party or the Libertarian Party may be able to pull some votes, that fear or that risk, I believe, is not as strong as it was 4 years ago, because so many people are on edge, and there's so many people that know that this is a one or the other choice, And I think the fact that the Democrats, early on, one after the other, you saw them quickly, the ones that knew that they were not going to be the nominee, eventually drop out and quickly endorse the eventual nominee. I remember when Amy Klobuchar, Beto O'Rourke, and Pete Buttigieg all decided to endorse Joe Biden at the same event. I believe he was in Texas. That was in March of this year. And I think that was really before the national shutdown changed everything. But I think my surprise that evening was at how different it was from the environment in 2016 when you had Bernie Sanders and Clinton duking it out all the way until June or July of 2016. It wasn't even that long before the convention had started that Bernie Sanders officially dropped out the race. But there's such a different environment in 2020. It's more like an emergency. Like everyone just, play your role and don't mess this up. I think that's kind of the feel a lot of people have because the shock of 2016's results is still in effect today. Mr. Foster, if you're on, I want to get your thoughts on that, sir. And you're on mute. Go ahead.
You've unmuted me? Okay. Thanks.
Yep.
I apologize. Whenever you get dinosaurs on, it's we have technical difficulties. Let's put it that way, and challenges. I'm not. I wasn't clear on your question, Mike.
I'm sorry, sir. So, talking about
You can restate the question.
Yeah. So, in what Cassandra was saying about a third party contender and what I had said about people being more on edge this year, wanting to ensure that no one is the cause or no demographic is the cause of a result happening that they didn't want. I'm wondering if you think that this is a much different environment than 2016 when a lot of folks were more willing to make a protest vote. There were a lot of people who did not like Clinton as the nominee. There are a lot of folks who didn't like Trump as the nominee. And so you saw someone like Gary Johnson enjoy more support than he did in 2012. And I'm wondering if you think the political environment is so.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the political environment in 2020 is definitely different than it was in 2016. Trump, of course, was a challenger then. He was seen as sort of an unknown, but people sold whatever he was selling. Or they bought whatever he was selling, those who wanted change. Hillary was not seen as a change agent, and she was successfully demonized by Trump. Now it's a whole different situation. Big challenger, party challenger on any ballot, except that I did notice that Kanye was polling, I believe, in the 3% range when I looked at the last. I think he's only on the Minnesota ballot, and he was polling about 3% in one poll that I saw, which was alarming to say the least. But the environment it's a totally different environment. I think that's obvious, and I am of course relieved that there is no significant change anywhere on the ballots. We didn't have to worry about that at all. Bill Stein and Gary Johnson were significant problems in a number of the key battleground states, and that is obviously not an issue. Question. Again,
Yeah. I think you're breaking up
some instability with my connection.
Yeah, you are. Christian, if you could just jump in real quick.
Yeah, I don't know if you or anyone heard of the grassroots kind of movement, Unity 2020. It got kind of shut down relatively quickly, but it was Brett Weinstein, he was a professor. His brother is also graduate of Harvard University, kind of famous brother duo. They've been on the Joe Rogan podcast, some other physics and biology podcasts, but they actually tried to come up with a plan similar to the original process, to where how you would have a different presidential and vice presidential party. And they had Tulsi Gabbard and I believe Dan Crenshaw were the two that kind of wound up at the end. And that was very interesting. You know, their proposal was 4 years of one and then 4 years the other, and you would flip which one was vice president and president. And that got shut down to the point to where their Twitter was actually canceled. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but I can definitely tell you that that is quite different than the support that we saw for Gary Johnson in 2016.
Yeah, you know, that's a good point. And I wanted to include, you know, in 2016, we're dealing with a pandemic. In 2016, you know, the possibility of a Trump presidency was just not a reality for folks. And I believe a lot of folks were content knowing that if they did not vote, that doesn't mean that Trump will be president. I don't think that really registered with people until they probably saw President Biden and President-elect Donald Trump in the Oval Office together. I know for me, that was a surreal moment. So I'm you know, when you're looking at all the different factors that
even after the fact, it was surreal for me. I thought I was in The Simpsons.
But you know, we're talking about, you know, the legal battle. And what's interesting is that in exactly a week until, you know, a week from tomorrow, a week ago tomorrow, Amy Coney Barrett was appointed as the 115th Supreme Court Justice on the Supreme Court. And now there was, and she was immediately faced with the option to recuse herself from an election case that was pending in the state of Pennsylvania, and she did. But I'm wondering if this is just a buildup for what's to come. If she can say, you know, I recused myself from the Pennsylvania election case, but I'm not going to recuse myself from a potential second Supreme Court case from Bush versus Gore. Professor Foster, your thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts basically is that regarding the Supreme Court, the damage has already been done. There's a 6-3 strong conservative majority on the court. Even if you discount Chief Justice Roberts as a moderate or an establishmentarian, there's still a 5-4 majority on the court. And I think the most interesting thing will be, to me, if Joe Biden wins and if the Democrats take the Senate, I think it sets up a battle between Congress and the Supreme Court for the next decade. I think that for the next decade, the Supreme Court will be in a position to disqualify much of what Congress seeks to do. And because the Congress has been, at least the Democrats have been, more of the more establishmentarians, I think that the court will flex itself going forward. Say, for example, if Roe v. Wade is struck down and a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president does something, proposes and passes something to kind of restore Roe v. Wade, it's still possible that the court could strike that down based on, any set of excuses that they can come up with. Because the litmus test now for getting on the court, and we talked about this before, has been kind of a religious fidelity to the pro-life position. And that, I think, will change the political makeup of the United States for the next generation.
Chris, jump in.
Yeah, and I also, along with that, you have to look at the words that Mitch McConnell put out just a week ago when he was speaking right after Justice Barrett was confirmed. He said basically, all that we did together over the last 4 years in some way or another will be undone by the new political reality that he's coming to see. And he's what he was saying is basically the court is the one way in which we can still have a stronghold over political life in America, because we already know that the Republican Party or the conservative movement, while they did win the 2016 election and they did win the Electoral College, it's still not a broadly popular sort of political grouping, right? And they know that it's very difficult for them to be able to win the popular vote. It's likely that they're going to lose the Senate. I think it's the 538 has Democrats a 76% chance to win the Senate. They have Biden a 90% chance of winning the presidency. And obviously they're likely to win the House. And so in order for, them to still have some semblance of power, it has to happen in the courts. And just like what Professor Foster was just saying, any legislation that may be proposed or passed can be undone, just like we're seeing almost about to happen with the Affordable Care Act. And so this is McConnell's and all the, conservatives on the right. This is their ability to be able to wield and control power, even if they don't even have the electoral or political votes there.
That's interesting that you brought up, the specific policies that would be at stake now with this 6-3 conservative tilt. And I said this, I was a guest on another podcast this past weekend, and I said, what's interesting is that the Republican side seems to be more intentional about their Supreme Court nomination process in terms of making sure that the folks that are on, when you're looking at Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, these are folks that you can see on the court for the next 10 to 20, 30 years. These are folks that are going to be not just deciding jurisprudence for the 2020s, but probably until the 2040s or 50s. And so, when you're looking at, these Supreme Court battles, to me, this whole nomination process took place so quick, and there was so much news going on that it was kind of like something that was pulled under the nose of the public, I think, because you've got a virus, you've got an election, you can't get away from even going on Instagram and seeing, go to the polls and vote, register to vote today. And so much is going on at the same time that this was just, I think, just one in a multitude of news stories that was going on. But, to your point, Chris, when we're looking at these policies and how they're going to play out, even if there is a blue wave like we're hearing, Nate Silver, as you pointed, gave Biden a 90% chance of becoming the 46th president of the United States, and Trump a 10% chance of being reelected the 45th president. But at the same time, in 2016, Nate Silver indicated that Clinton had a 71.4% chance of being the next president, and Trump had a 28.6% chance. And I was listening to a pollster, and she said, what's interesting is that 4 years ago, we were so focused on that larger number, because that seemed like the more probable thing that was going to happen. But nobody really paid attention to that 28.6%. But in this election, everyone's focusing on that 10% that Nate Silver has. And the 90% is something that they're like, we're not getting confident about that. Let's not get cocky about that. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But, as it relates to Mitch McConnell and, the statement he made on the Senate floor about the Supreme Court, I'm wondering how this is going to play out with a Supreme Court that's very majority conservative and a potential House and White House that is Democratic. You're not going to have a trifecta like you did in 2016. Garrison, I was curious to get your thoughts as to how do you think, if things go in that way, how do you think the next 4 years will look?
If Trump remains president or if Biden remains president, how the Supreme Court will look in the next couple of years?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. If the Supreme Court, what as it is right now, 6-3 conservative majority, goes ahead with jurisprudence in the next 4 years, how is that going to play out with a potential Democratic Senate and a Democratic president and a Democratic House?
I mean, it's definitely gonna be a battle back and forth, but as to how far, how much head ground either one would make, I don't know. I mean, I feel like a lot of the times it definitely comes down to what the people think. And wherever a lot of decisions come down to is, and I know this isn't really a factor with the Supreme Court, but on the House and the Senate and the floor and everything, it is. They're going to base their stuff off what's going to keep them in a seat of power, not necessarily the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to make whatever decision they want to make. Within each other, I mean, if there's more conservatives, there's more conservatives. There's less, and if there's more Democrats, there's more Democrats. But right now, I don't know. It's tough to say.
Christian, your thoughts?
This is actually interesting. I had a class at Campbell University, and we read a book on whether divided or united governments actually make a difference. And when you take a meta-analysis, just overview look, it doesn't really make a difference considering the nature of our political structure. The gridlock is kind of inherent. There has been war between, just constant war, different phases of it between the judicial and legislative branch. But when it comes down to it, it's such a complex system, especially since the creation of the administrative office of the president, that it really doesn't matter.
Cassandra, do you agree?
Could you repeat the part of the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, he basically was saying that, no matter if you have a blue wave potentially of, which is what a lot of polls are showing, with Biden in the White House and the Senate being in Democratic control and the House remaining in Democratic hands, but you have a 6-3 conservative majority, what you're going to see is just more gridlock, especially like Chris had pointed out, the Affordable Care Act is on the ballot. But at the same time, it seems like it's out of the control of the voters to a degree because the Affordable Care Act case and immigration case and all of these cases will be determined by a body that's not elected, and the majority of them, 6 of them, are, you kind of know which direction they're going to go. I'm wondering if you agree that, even if things work out according to the Democrats' favor tomorrow, that, you're still going to see not much progressive change because of the Supreme Court that's in place.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that this was McConnell's long game and he won. I think that we, strategically have a long game ahead of us if we're going to try to fix something like this. I personally think that the fact that the courts have a 6-3 pretty consistent conservative majority is going to have vast impacts on us for at least another 20 years. It's going to be, I think, if the Democrats are able to retain a majority after this election for however many cycles, there's going to be a lot of push and pull between the court saying, this isn't constitutional, rewrite it this way, and then they're going to try to rewrite it, and then it's going to be pushed back for another reason or another. I foresee that being one of the biggest struggles if we manage to have a changeover in administration and for some reason it's able to go smoothly. I think that's going to be a long-term issue that the Democrats are going to have to address. I think that what you mentioned earlier about the conservatives having more strategy, being more strategic about placing people on the court is right. And I think now we're dealing with the consequences of Democrats not having that foresight.
And I think, when I said that, I was thinking of the fact that you had Ginsburg, as wonderful and as beloved as she was, I started to wonder, when the Democrats had the Senate and the House in 2009 and 2010, why didn't she step down and allow a younger progressive judge to take her place, that would be, going on for the next decade or more. But when you look at Republicans like Kennedy, this Republican appointee like Kennedy, the summer of 2018, he stepped down and it was kind of like, out of the blue. When he stepped down, it paved the way for a Kavanaugh, so it seems like they're more intentional, and I'm wondering if that's going to be their downfall. If there's another way that the progressives can get an agenda passed, or if the conservatives have played checkmate. Mr. Foster, go ahead and mute yourself.
Yeah, there's a lot of irony here because, of course, the conservatives have been their main talking point in appointing people to the federal judiciary is that they wanted people who were going to just interpret the Constitution and not override the legislative branch and make law themselves. But now they are dependent on the judiciary to be activists. They're dependent on if that is the Democrats get into a unitary governmental control situation where they control both houses of Congress and the presidency. The conservatives will be dependent on an activist Congress. I'm sorry, an activist judiciary. That is the real long game. And it's also interesting that let me make a prediction. If and when the Affordable Care Act is abolished, basically, and that will probably happen this summer when the Supreme Court issues all of its rulings on cases that it's hearing, starting the cases that it's already started hearing in October. But if the Affordable Care Act is abolished, that will be the impetus for the Democrats, if they are in full control of the Senate, the House, and the presidency, to then expand the Supreme Court. That will be the motivator. That Biden will take that as a personal affront, having been in the Obama administration, and I don't think anything similar that they can pass will make it. So I just think that they will. That will be the motivator for them to stack the court, as it were, in order to regain a balance. They'll get rid of the filibuster, which was the problem. Harry Reid got rid of the filibuster for judicial nominations during the Obama administration because McConnell was stifling every one of his appointments, or trying to, and the frustration led to Harry Reid, of course, getting rid of the filibuster for judicial nominations, but they didn't get rid of it for Supreme Court nominations. Then when McConnell got control, he got rid of it for Supreme Court nominations as well. And that's the only way that, for sure, Kavanaugh got on. But in any case, I think the turning down of the Affordable Care Act, or the abolishment of the Affordable Care Act by the Supreme Court, which I definitely anticipate with a 6-3 majority, will be the catalyst that will cause the Democrats, almost force them to expand the Supreme Court next year.
And expanding the Supreme Court was such a controversial topic this year, it seemed, and I was really surprised at first at the Democrats' response. At first, it looked like they didn't want to respond to the question. And when you saw Pence debate Harris, he was asked about healthcare, and he turned the question into one about packing the Supreme Court, and Harris fell for it. Harris walked right into the trap. Nate, I want to get your response and take on whether you think, or what do you think the Democrats' response to packing the Supreme Court should be? Should they shy away from it? I've said on this platform, I said, look, regardless of whether Biden is for or against it, it's ultimately up to Congress. If I were in Biden's position and I didn't want to answer that question affirmatively, I would just say, look, ask your Senate candidates, ask your House candidates. They're the ones that ultimately have the vote on this thing. You know, I'll do whatever. I'm the executive. You know, I'm running for the executive position, the chief executive position. I'm going to just enforce what it is that they passed, or I'm going to. What is your take on that, Nate?
Well, I agree with you that Kamala fell into that court packing trap, but I did like her answer on it, which was that the Trump administration has set a record for most judges considered unqualified by the American Bar Association. I do agree that the courts need to be expanded. Litigation is supposed to be accessible. And we hear about, in law school, we hear about all these jurisdictions where litigation takes forever because of the sheer number of cases that are being passed in states like California, for example. The reason the Supreme Court has 9 justices in the first place is because the amount of circuit courts of appeal was expanded to 9. We have 12 circuit courts of appeal now. We probably need at least 2 or 3 more. So yeah, we should expand the courts. We need the most vulnerable in our society to have an avenue to say, hey, something was done to me that I believe was wrong, and I need redress for it. But yes, that's what the answer should be. We should expand the courts because we need people to have that avenue for them if they want to take it. We need the courts. We need our court system. We need the people's court system to be accessible.
Garrison, I'm curious to know if you agree or if you disagree as to whether or not court expansion should even be on the table.
For something like that to be approved, what would it have to go through?
Well, I'll have to get approval from Congress. When FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, tried to get it enacted, it was he tried to pack the courts, I believe, by even more than 9. I think he was trying to get about 15 or 14 justices on the court. But regardless, he'll have to go through Congress, and Congress blocked him. And so this was during the era with the New Deal program, and so the court at the time had blocked some of his New Deal initiatives. And so his solution to that was trying to pack the court with judges that would be more sympathetic or in alignment with his judicial philosophy that would approve of his programs. Of course, that didn't get passed, but I'm wondering if you would think that today in 2020, 2021, if there's a new Biden-Harris administration, do you believe that, it would be fine or right for them to consider packing the Supreme Court, given that there's a 6-3 tilt?
I would be fine with the court expanding, but I don't think it should be packed by one president. I think it should be, if anything, like, let's say Biden wins this election, he should be able to pick maybe one candidate, and the next time there's a Republican president, and there's need for an expansion again, that's when it should happen. I think there should be some fairness to it, not just once the president gets elected, let's just pack it full of my party's guys. I think it should I do think it should probably be like an odd number like it is now with 9. I don't think it should be like 10.
Professor Foster, you look like you're jumping to get in.
It's baffling to me. This President Trump, put 3 people on the court, put one person on the court 1 week before the election. The court has been packed in front of our very eyes. We're living in a post-establishment, post-traditional era. The Democrats are the last to realize that. The Democrats keep posing. The Democrats have become the small C conservatives. They're the ones trying to act out of tradition. Those traditions are gone. Donald Trump has broken through all of those traditions. And so now we're in an era where the new era of establishment will be established. And I think that that's the challenge of the Democratic Party. Unless the Democratic Party moves affirmatively and strongly to put in place an agenda and to reestablish the foundations of this democracy, that's when you will have the atrophy. Unless they do that, there'll be an atrophy of young people voting. You have to give people something to vote for. You need to have to give women something to vote for. You need to give poor white men something to vote for. And this small c conservatism that the Democratic Party is wishing for, the era of statesmen and all of that. I mean, have you seen Mitch McConnell? Have you seen Lindsey Graham? These are not statesmen. These are not people who have stood by any traditions that our government has run on. And so now we've got to establish a new establishment. I do want to say one other thing about the courts and the lack of democratic purposefulness on the court. To me, Barack Obama blew an opportunity. Instead of nominating Garland Merritt, he should have nominated a Black female. That would have made what the Republicans did seem to be more partisan, or at least it would have appeared to be as partisan as it was. So I think that, again, the Democrats trying to be, he nominated Garland Merritt, a white male, moderate, he thought would be acceptable. You're playing with gangsters. You cannot negotiate with gangsters. You have to be gangsters with gangsters.
Christian, do you agree?
Oh, sorry.
I had a previous question. I'll try to remember it. But right then, why do you say that he should have nominated a Black woman?
Because again, it would have made what they did to Garland Merritt seem less politically acceptable for them. It would have made them appear to be racist.
Professor,
that's
I'm
racist to me, but very intelligent. But it does.
Yeah, well, I'm not afraid of that because we're dealing with racists. So I'm not shying away from dealing with racists in a racist way politically. On a personal basis, yes, I won't be racist. But when I'm dealing with people who are politically racist, I will deal with them as they are.
Fair point.
Yeah, I wanted to say, Professor, thank you for saying that, because I found it less and less tolerable to figure that Democrats should try to continue taking the high road and being accepting of everyone and just tolerant of this, tolerant of that. If only we can get everyone on the same page and acting sanely, we can do this by the book like we used to. I don't believe that really ever worked. I think that that's a really milquetoast way for people who are in power or have some like moderate power stay comfortable rather than really doing their job for us as representatives. And so, yeah, I agree. I understand what the concern is with the idea of like an incoming Biden presidency, quote unquote, stacking the courts and the appearance it might have of being bipartisan. But like, why are we concerned about bipartisanship when the other part of our bicameral system has completely abandoned any pretense of trying to act in good faith? Like, if we don't believe that they're going to act in good faith, why should we keep extending that grace instead of like, gloves off, bare knuckle brawling? Like, that's what we're at right now. And if we keep being like, cry uncle, like, they're not going to stop. So we need to be more responsive to the reality that we're in. And if that reality is they've stacked the courts right in front of us, then we should respond in kind to bring true neutrality or true like balance back that people in the electorate can believe in. Otherwise, we're precariously at the point where people do not believe that this government works. I mean, a lot of us already don't, but like it really is precarious, more so than I feel like it ever has been.
Gary, jump in, man.
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts here. First, let me get to what the professor says. I agree with you. Not necessarily with the idea that we should just put a black woman there. What I think Obama should have done is he should have put somebody there that was aligned with, I think, the liberal cause, that was aligned with what would have kind of excited the base. Because what I think he did with Merrick Garland is he said, well, this is a moderate judge who could be, digestible to Republicans. He should have went with somebody who is going to stand on the shoulders of Ginsburg or Thurgood Marshall. And what that would have done for Hillary is that, in 2016, the reason why the Never Trumpers came over and supported Trump was because Trump was able to be very persuasive to Republicans about the Supreme Court. And if Obama would have nominated a person that would have tried the base and said that, if I win, I'm gonna nominate this person, but if you come out and support me, we're gonna a lot more. And that argument of whether or not 2016, like, I think Hillary might have won if Obama would have nominated somebody that could have kind of excited the base, especially for the people who were not fans of Hillary. I think the second part is, I want to talk about the court stacking. I might, upset some people, but I actually think Republicans are right on this argument. I don't think we should be stacking the court. I think, in the Constitution, it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that there has to be 9 justices. But I think if we stack the court, what we run the risk of doing is, if Biden stacks it to 11 judges, then the next Republican going to come in maybe in 4 years, 8 years, and then they add 2 or 3 more judges. So, like, when would this stacking the court stop? I think in the alternative, the best thing probably to do is to look at the way that we set up our appellate system, which is, the problem for us right now is not that we want, there's no such thing as Republican or liberal judges. The question is, how will they interpret statutes and how they interpret the Constitution? Right now, we have a lot of textualists and new textualists on the Supreme Court. More aligned with the liberal interpretation of the Constitution and statutes. I think what you have in the appellate circuit is you have like a panel, right? You have maybe like, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have like 27, 30 judges on the appellate circuit. And for every case, they're like randomly drawn, right? So these 5 judges who are randomly drawn out of these 30 judges will hear this case, right? I think if we move towards a system like that, where you have a group of judges, in every case would be a group of 7 judges or 9 judges that are randomly pulled from that panel, that looks more like our appellate courts. I think that makes more sense. But I think it's very short-sighted to say, when Biden comes to office, let him appoint 2 judges to make that 11, and you're still going to be down 6-5. So do you want to move to 13, where now we're trying to push through, 4 or 5 or 6 judges? And then what's going to stop Republicans from doing the same? So that's a never-ending cycle. I think that's very short-sighted. So I think that we need to look at, some of our appellate circuits and how they have this panel there, and it's all randomly drawn out of a group of 20 or 15 judges for every single case. So I think that's a better way to do it. So I think Kamala should have shut down these discussions about stacking the court. It's important for her because, as we're talking about, Mike, the Senate races, Democrats just need 3 seats, pick up 3 seats to get the 50. Because if Kamala is the VP, then now we have the majority, because she's the president of she'd be over the Senate. So my entire viewpoint is I think that we should not be stacking the court. I think we should be articulating a new way for that system to look. And get back to the professor's point, I agree in the standpoint that we should have never put forth a moderate judge. We should have put somebody that would have excited the base. So Hillary could have had that same argument Trump had, which was, if you don't like me, fine, but here's the Supreme Court, and this is why it's important. This is how we got to move forward. So
there's a lot to unpack because, and I'm Jerry, I'm glad you brought, the importance of appellate court level, the appellate circuit level, because when we're looking at packing the courts, the discussion seems to focus mainly on Supreme Court packing. But we often don't hear much about the amount of judges on the district court level and the appellate court level that Obama should have had the opportunity to fill in 2016, and that Trump has filled in. And I think Trump has filled in a record number of amount of appellate and district court judges in. But before I transition, I wanted to know if there are any other thoughts on this before we move on to the last professor.
Yeah, just quickly. I'm for packing the Supreme Court because it is the Supreme Court. It's where all appeals end up. And the appellate system has been packed as well. But again, ultimately, all appeals will come to the Supreme Court, and they can do as they wish, because that is the last stop in the judicial system. And the Supreme Court is, in the era, especially in the era of a dysfunctional Congress, the most powerful part of our government.
Yeah, can I say something, Professor? But what would stop Republicans from doing the same when they get back in power?
That's really not my concern. I will play hardball until the hardball stops. I'm not trying to be reasonable with Republicans anymore. I don't see.
Because someone argued that we had the same approach with a filibuster years ago, and then he came back and bit us when McConnell got into power, right? So McConnell have done a lot of things really because stuff that we did when we were in power, it was kind of short-sighted. So, if we move this, add 2 judges and we're still down 6-5, where they still have the majority, what's stopping them from saying, hey, I got to add 2 more in 2028? 2028 or 2032. So I think we got to look, towards that too.
You could always amend the Constitution to limit the number of seats in the court. You could do that.
If I could, I'd say that's a 2028 problem. Senator Reid adjusting the filibuster worked for the situation. He said, this is what we need to do right now in order to get to where we need to go. McConnell saw that and he said, okay, now I'm going to play hardball too. McConnell played hardball, and it seems that hardball is going to its logical conclusion, which is that it's looking very likely that come January, he's going to hand over the majority leadership to someone else, presumably Chuck Schumer or whoever the Democrats choose. But that's a problem that we need to worry about then, and probably just focus on, hey, we know what's at stake now. We need to not take these things for granted as much anymore, because 2016, the Democratic Party did not do a good enough job of saying, hey, the Supreme Court is at stake, and what that means is that the Affordable Care Act is at stake. DACA is at stake. Roe versus Wade is at stake. Reproductive freedom is at stake. The environment is at stake. Because of that, these are all things that the court has ruled on in the past and is looking forward to ruling on again. So play hardball now and worry about the consequences later. It's what's worked for the Republicans so far. There's no indication to say it wouldn't work for Democrats as well.
I want to transition a little bit, because this has been a wild election, folks. This has been a wild election. And with every election, there's always that defining moment, or that one moment that pundits and historians look back to and pinpoint and say, well, this moment really changed the tide. This point of the election really changed it. For 2012, Hurricane Sandy, I think, was that thing. And you also had the 47% comment with Mitt Romney. But in 2016, it was so different in 2016, because what would have been the moment was the Access Hollywood tape. But of course, because we saw folks like even Paul Ryan jump ship, and Pence even came out with a statement. But you also had Hillary Clinton call Trump supporters deplorables. A lot of folks say that there was a mistake. A lot of folks say no, she should have actually hammered more on that. In 2020, I want to go around and get each of your thoughts as to what you think the moment in this election was. And this is going to be the last question for the evening. You want to start with Chris?
Well, I'll say that the moment that has defined this election actually started in March, which was COVID-19. Basically, when COVID had overtaken the country and we started to shut down, that was at the tail end of the primary election on the Democratic side. And what it caused Bernie Sanders to do was to have to drop out sooner, which I think he was going to do because he didn't want to kind of like allow for the primary election to linger any further. So that happened then. And then most of the country had to, folks were losing jobs. You had folks on the breadline. You got universities shut down. You have governments needing federal aid, and so much has happened. And Trump's response and his inability to take responsibility for handling the virus really has cost him. Right? We are now 230,000 people who have passed. Over 10 million people who have contracted the virus, and it's the numbers are continuing to surge now. And as sharp as those numbers continue to increase, you start to see Trump's poll numbers decrease, right? And prior to 2020, one of the things that Trump was able to kind of hold high for his reelection bid was his economy. And he was saying this is the greatest economy. He's built the greatest economy in the world, disregarding all of the improvements and progress that the Obama administration had created in order to help us get to this point. But that economy is no longer strong, right? There are millions of people who are filing for unemployment weekly. There are millions of people whose jobs or their businesses have gone under and haven't gotten enough aid or relief to really rescue themselves. And so that has been the thing. COVID-19 has been the thing that has been looming over this election, that even Donald Trump has been trying to spin, but he can't, because lives and science is real, numbers are real. And unfortunately, I think that it's somewhat of a good thing that this may be what brings him out of the office, but it's also unfortunate that it costs our country 230,000 people beautiful, precious lives who are no longer going to be at the dinner table on Thanksgiving and no longer be able to wrap gifts on Christmas because of his inability to act and be responsible as a president. So I think that's the defining characteristic of this election.
Yeah, and I honestly think this will go down as the COVID election. You really can't point to an election where a crisis really just swallowed up the whole year. But Cassandra, I want to get your thoughts as to what you think the defining moment was. Chris mentioned the COVID.
I'm gonna say that I agree with Chris on this, but in a way, I feel like the moment you're trying to describe doesn't really exist, which is why I'm a little alarmed. This has been a parade of mismanagement and errors, and we're still at a point where we're anxiously awaiting what we think may or may not happen, which in any reasonable world, this should be definitive. It should show that our government has failed us. So we deserve to have a government turnover, and I think that's the general sentiment. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our electoral system is going to be responsive to that. So that alarms me. Chris said it was 230,000 people, and counting our dead. 9/11, there were 3,000 casualties, and that drastically changed our national policies, our foreign policy, our policy on torture, our policy on terrorism. We had a huge national trauma that we responded to, in some ways maybe overboard, but we responded, and I don't think that mentally it's connected to many people yet, that this is a travesty of multiple proportions over anything that was as terrible as 9/11 or the Vietnam War even. We are, and counting. And this is happening in our own country through negligence. The fact that this atrocity has happened and we're still at this point talking about it, I have no words for how upset it makes me.
Christian, I want to get your thoughts as to what you think, what you may have thought, watching this election unfold between 2019 and now, primary season till now. If there are any moments that stood out to you that really changed the tide one way or the other. Cassandra mentioned, go ahead, sir.
No, you're fine. I apologize. I'd like to lighten the mood a little bit. I agree with everything that's been said. Let's flip this and just say some chance Trump wins. I would say the moment that you could look back to way back was the first time he mentioned the word fake news, because that completely changed the landscape in this country.
That's a good point. Professor Foster? Oh, you're muted, sir. I'm sorry.
I agree with both what Christian and Chris said. I think they're both notable. I will just add, just because my brother and I are the dinosaurs on here, the parallel, the only time that I can think of where an issue lasted as long as COVID was the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, 1980. That colored the whole campaign, kind of like COVID does now. Of course, it was not nearly as tragic. Jimmy Carter brought them home all alive, but it did cost him his presidency. But I think Christian's point about fake news is real, because fake news, I think, is what has enabled Corona to be viewed as a hoax still to this day by some Americans.
And I'm glad you brought that out, because even in the documentary that has been released on Netflix pertaining to social media, I think it's called The Social Dilemma. It indicates what kind of lasting effect, damaging lasting effect, this whole terminology of fake news has, and the connotations behind it. Because if you have an electorate that can't even trust the news they're getting, what kind of detrimental impacts is that having for democracy? And the media has been called the fourth estate, the fourth branch of government, for so many years. But now you have a situation where, if I'm getting my news from Fox, or if I'm getting my news from CNN and MSNBC, I'm only going to look for certain sources that align with either of those networks pertaining to my own liking. And when you have a situation like COVID or any other crisis where there is no political skew one way or the other, but despite that, there are folks who are trying to portray this thing make this thing political. Mask wearing became political. Whether or not you wear a mask was determinative of whether you stand on one side of the line or the other. That's a dangerous thing. Go ahead.
In more ways than one, you could say it has been described like this in the past, but not for nefarious reasons like we're going into now, a shadow branch.
That's interesting. Nate, I want to get your thoughts, man.
In my opinion, the defining moment of this election wasn't this calendar year, but last year, when a brave individual in the White House came forward and said the president of the United States was so afraid to face Joe Biden that he tried to solicit help from a foreign country. Before a single vote had been casted in any primary, that was the moment to me that I knew Joe Biden was probably going to become the nominee, because every Democratic candidate was going to have to say, Donald Trump tried to cheat in this election because he didn't want to face Joe Biden. And that's when Joe Biden's numbers started to increase, even when we saw those, even early on when he saw some disappointments in Iowa and New Hampshire, there was still that whole there was still the impeachment going on, which centered on, did Donald Trump solicit aid from a foreign country because he did not want to face Joe Biden? Now, I don't think Biden did a good enough job of playing into that this summer and this past few months, but that to me was the moment it became very clear that it was going to be Trump Biden. When Trump tried to solicit a foreign country that the US is normally aligned with for dirt on an opponent that had not even been selected yet, because he did not want to have to run up against Joe Biden.
That's interesting. And the impeachment proceeding is almost forgettable now that we're dealing with COVID in November of 2020. Mr. Foster, if you're with us, give us your thoughts, sir. I think he's having a little bit of problems. But Jerry, go right ahead.
Yeah, for me, I think the moment really was November 10th, 2016. I think most people remember how they felt that morning, how they felt trying to grasp this new reality of Donald Trump being the president of the United States. And we saw it with the Women's March right away that next January. So, I don't know if it was necessarily COVID or him being impeached or all the crazy stuff that he did, but I think a lot of people November 10th, 2016, was already looking forward to tomorrow, and they just been waiting for 4 years. So this energy people have been waiting for tomorrow for years, and the fact that he has just been so incompetent and has led to really just embarrass this country is why we have seen such a high voter turnout. But to kind of narrow the question with this particular election, I think South Carolina really changed things for me, because to see the Democratic Party really get behind one person that quickly, and it gave Joe Biden the opportunity to really start to organize a campaign and really kind of widen his general election campaign, where he had the entire party behind him, where in 2016 Hillary didn't have that. Was in a nomination, the convention, and she was getting booed, right? And people still split, and people still split to this day. So the fact to see Bernie drop out, to see everybody drop out, and really generally throw their support around him, really I think helped him organize a campaign. Because I think that if this was a very toxic campaign that got dragged out into June or July, I think that would have been very hard to get the party together to take on Trump tomorrow, because as we've seen, the Republicans are behind him. This is their Obama. They are behind him 100%. So I think for this election, I think South Carolina changed everything, to see people get behind Biden and to generally throw their support around him so early. I really think it set him up to actually run a very, very great campaign that he did this year.
And Garrison, I'm going to get your thoughts, sir.
As your fake news correspondent, I think that fake news is a thing, but overall, I think when it comes to presenting facts and everything, they're getting them from a source. They're getting them from someone they know inside the White House, from CDC officials, whoever. But overall, throughout this campaign, I think the biggest thing that probably stood out to me was that very first presidential debate. We saw a Democrat and a Republican, and now this probably was started with Trump and his rhetoric, but we saw them both going at each other's necks. When people talk about debates, oftentimes it comes up the Kennedy-Nixon debate. This, I feel like, was one of those debates where it will go down probably in the history books as eye-opening to the American people, as to these are what politicians can and sometimes are. That they can be two white men arguing and ready to throw fists if it comes down to it. Even Joe Biden said he would do that. So I think that's what stood out to me probably the most out of this entire election cycle.
And I'm glad you brought that up. I was actually going to indicate that, but there were many moments, as we're wrapping up. One moment that stands out to me too is, when Trump used the guards at his disposal to throw tear gas at folks in Washington, D.C. To hold up a Bible in front of a church. I think the imagery that was intended behind that photo had a ironically different meaning. You had mentioned, Garrison, the first debate. I think, and one of the things I'm so happy to have this debate, this whole episode is that we can have a civil disagreement. I disagree. I think that Trump had created the toxic environment we saw, and I think it was indicative of when you had the next week, or whenever they had the dueling town halls. He was with Susanna Guthrie, and it was a completely different environment. He was almost debating and fighting with Susanna Guthrie, while Joe Biden was having more of a cordial, traditional conversation with the moderator in that situation. And I think that was indicative of the fact that Trump had created this environment. And Trump, I think, wasn't trying to let Biden get a word in. He was you constantly heard his mouth running like a motor. But I think that in this election, Chris really hit the nail on the head. COVID-19 swallowed up the coverage. So COVID-19, the death rate, the amount of cases that we've been experiencing as a nation, and the lack of a unified national approach, I think will go down as the determining factor as to how and why this election turned out the way. Regardless of what happens, it's not guaranteed the Democrats would win, even though polls indicate otherwise. But no matter what happens, I think this will go down as a pandemic election. But, I really had fun tonight, honestly. I thank each of you for the contributions you made, Professor Foster, Nate Honore, Cassandra Knopf, Chris Johnson, Jerry Ford, Garrison, Christian Evans. And I want to just pause and I want to thank Christian Evans and Garrison. This is my first time having them on. I've had each of the others on, but I just want to thank you all for being a part of this. I didn't get to give your intros, but you're both very accomplished gentlemen in your own right. And I'm glad that you were able to share your views on the podcast. I want to also thank Mr. Stephen Foster, Mackenzie Boyd. I know she had some connection problems. Hopefully we can have her for the autopsy of the election. But, I want to just go ahead and close out. This was supposed to be my last broadcast for the series of discussions I've had. I started this project in July of this year. And when I started it started pretty funny. My brother said, we're looking at the news and we're looking at Trump. And I said, he says, he looks at me and he smiles and he says, what if you can transport to November 4th of 2020 and you see that Trump was reelected? What would you do if you can go back to now? And this was July again. And I said, well, I would create some kind of platform to have discussions. I'll create a podcast or something. And so he said, so you know what to do and you're not doing it. And I had nothing to say. So that's why I started this. And so I'm glad to have, this series of discussion where we can have folks who are independent, who have not made up their mind, conservatives, liberal, progressive, moderates. And I'm glad that we were able to have discussions that I think highlighted points that a lot of times the media didn't cover. I think that we were able to bring perspectives that weren't shared in a lot of different venues. And I really appreciate that. But I would announce that this won't be my last. I'm going to have a episode after the election, and then I'm going to pause and pick it up in December. So it's going to be interesting. I want to thank each of you for what you've brought to the table. I had fun. At times it could be a little tense, but it's all adding to the interest, the interest. And, we're all passionate about this country. And I just want to thank you all for the contribution you made and encouraging folks to also be engaged with the political process. A lot of folks feel like they have to be apathetic. They have to give up. There's noise on both sides, and we don't want to, take a position either way because not either one is not 100% in agreement with what we want. I thank each of you for, reminding folks that, we still have a stake in this. We still have to perform our civic duty and vote. And the election is going to be tomorrow. And what we're going to see is that even in the midst of a tragedy, the oldest democracy in the world is going to be at work. And I love to see it. It's like the Olympics for me. So thank you all. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this broadcast.